Welcome to episode 12 of season 3 of Read by the Author. The author, all of a sudden I'm from New York. Okay, I'm not. Welcome to episode 12 of the third season of Read by the Author. This episode, we are continuing with Time Anomaly, the second book in the ECHO TRILOGY, and last episode we started a section in Kat's perspective, and so tonight I think we're doing 3 chapters, I'm pretty sure. They're all in Kat's perspective, and then next week we'll hop back to Lex. So let's get into the story. Also, I need to, if you look, my bookshelves are actually clean because I cleaned my office. They're organized. Yay! I know you guys can't see them on Discord, but in the video. But also my dog is in the office. She's right there. And she's snoring. So that will be in the background. 29. Over and Under. Marcus was sitting behind the folding desk in the office in the front half of his 2-room canvas tent, Asset and me standing side by side opposite him. We were all using the equipment left over from the excavation a few weeks ago, and though the location had changed, the layout was more or less the same, except for the bathroom and shower trailer. That hadn't made it across the miles of desert, which sucked. In my opinion, a 5-gallon jug of water per person per day was not enough water to stay both hydrated and clean.
You're certain?
Marcus studied Asset and me, his eyes seeming to pick apart and weigh each tiny little nuance of our expressions and stances.
And you really think there's some part of the oasis under there?
Asset maintained her smile, though it was starting to wilt, and nodded for the 1,000th time. Yes, I am certain. Why don't you believe me when I say that I remember all?
Because I don't,
Heru said, not taking his eyes off her. And we have discussed this, dear brother. It is what had to be. I sighed. My feet were getting tired from standing. We'd been there for nearly an hour, and I was starting to feel a little lightheaded. Look, Marcus, I saw it too. Not inside or anything, but the huge slab of whatever it was. At, Asset clarified, was definitely blocking the mouth of some kind of tunnel. Marcus stared at me for a moment, then shifted his focus back to Asset and squinted the barest amount.
All right.
He nodded.
We'll start digging tonight while it's cooler. Hopefully we'll be done by morning.
He paused, hesitated.
And you're sure that whatever's left under there is safe? That it's not going to collapse on our people?
Asset's smile regained its brilliance. Few places have ever been safer. Yeah, she was super nice and sweet and stuff, but holy hell could Asset be mysterious when she wanted to be. Okay, author's note, I just have to say, because I just finished rewatching season 1 of Bridgerton for the No Shelf Control podcast, because we're discussing the adaptation from book to series for The Duke and I, the first book in that series, and the first season of that show. And he's definitely not how I described Marcus, but I don't know how you say his name. Reggie Jean Page, or I'm sure it's said in a much fancier way than that. But he totally, I feel like he exudes a lot of like Marcus-iness. The Duke, Duke of Hastings. I could totally see him as Marcus if it were like adapted into a series. I would be very excited about that. It's not how I describe him. It's not how I picture him, but I do think his presence has very Marcus-iness to him. So yeah, there we go. There he is for people on the video. Marcus pointed to the arched, opaque slab that had been uncovered by the 7th rotation of Nezarets just as the sun peaked over the dunes to the east.
So you're telling me that is made of At, like this?
He touched the small lump under his shirt, which I assumed to be the bottle Asset had delivered to him when she'd first shown up nearly 2 weeks ago.
And that Lex made it?
Aset nodded. Carson and I stood behind them a few feet, sneaking glimpses between shoulders when we could. His fingers brushed against the back of my hand, and my eyes snapped to his face. He was watching me, not the door, a shy smile curving his lips. My heart melted into a puddle of heart-shaped goo. His smile widened, his blue eyes sparkling, and he took hold of my hand, slipping his fingers between mine. Yeah, complete and utter goo.
The rest of the city was made of, Marcus said. I lived here for over 1,000 years before the collapse. How did I not know the Great Father built the whole place out of art?
He did not want you to know. It was a dangerous thing, knowing what he was capable of. Marcus was quiet for a long time, standing beside his sister and staring at the tall door of quartz-like art.
Do you think Apep will return? He asked her quietly.
She shrugged. Eventually.
Then perhaps I shouldn't enter, shouldn't learn Lex's secrets. If he returns and...
Aset touched his arm. He will return, and there is only one place where you will be safe from possession. For now. She nodded toward the door. He cannot possess you when you are surrounded by so much art. Besides, just because he is possessing you, that doesn't mean he has access to your thoughts. You'll only know what you choose to share with him. Marcus shook his head.
How could you possibly know?
Aset laughed, a cheerful chiming sound, and linked her arm with his. In time, all will make sense, dear brother. For you sooner than for most, I think. You shall see. She guided him forward, ignoring his obvious hesitance. Come on. I exchanged a look with Carson.
So we found the door to get inside.
My brow furrowed. How do you think we get through it? Carson shrugged and returned his gaze to the slab of art, and his eyes bulged at the same time as murmurs and whispers broke out among the dozens of Negerettes standing around the sloping hole, watching the siblings approach the door. He tugged on my hand.
Look, Cat, look!
I did, and my mouth fell open. The door was glowing, just like the Ott chest had done when Lex had approached it back in Senenmut's underground temple. Marcus and Aset were dark silhouettes against the bright, iridescent glow of the door. I could just make out her profile as she looked up at her brother. She started nodding, and Marcus extended his hand toward the glowing slab of Ott. With a sizzling sound, it dissolved into a myriad of colorful, misty tendrils. They slowly expanded upward, outward, fading until they evaporated completely and the slab of Ott was gone. Through the opening it left behind, there was nothing but absolute darkness. Marcus looked over his shoulder, snapping orders to whichever Negerette was closest.
Bring the LED rope, flashlights, headlamps, anything that'll provide light.
He glanced around.
Carlyle.
Yes, sir, said Marcus's man, who handled pretty much everything, as he brushed past my right shoulder and made his way down the ramp of sand toward Marcus in the doorway. Whenever I heard Carlyle speak, his words were very proper and British. I dubbed him Jeeves in my mind.
Call Dom or Nephi, Marcus told him. They should be leaving Cairo with Lex's family in a few hours.
I'm aware, sir. Marcus raised one eyebrow.
Tell them to procure generators, LED ropes, and whatever else you think we'll need to light up whatever's left in there.
He pointed toward the mouth of the tunnel with his chin. Very well. With a slight bow of his head, Carlyle turned and started walking away from Marcus. He pulled one of the uber high-tech satellite cell phones all of Marcus's top people seemed to have out of his back pocket as he walked. A skinny, blonde Negerette I mentally labeled as one of Marcus's minions, one of the many of his people who weren't old enough, powerful enough, or useful enough to warrant a seat at the grown-ups table, where all of Marcus's plans were discussed and put into action, ran past Carlyle at a jog, her arms filled with flashlights and headlamps. She skidded to a halt beside Marcus. Here you go, Heru. She lowered her eyes in deference, but I just thought it made her look weak. With a wet mop attitude like hers, she'd never climb high in the Nezarette ranks.
"Thank you, Amelia,"
Marcus said, fishing a headlamp out from the tangle and handing it to Aset before taking one for himself. After he had his headlamp situated on his buzzed head, looking pretty silly, in my opinion, he selected a flashlight, one of the enormous ones that shone as brightly as a spotlight. Without another word, without even a glance around to see if anyone else was ready to follow, Marcus plunged into the darkness, quickly becoming little more than 2 retreating beams of light. Aset selected a flashlight of her own and started looking around, scanning the faces like she was searching for someone. When her eyes landed on me, she grinned and waved me over. "Come on, Katarina. You're just as responsible for finding this as I am, so you must explore with me." Her smile was so genuine, her eyes so warm, that I thought, had she been human, she would have made an excellent mother. She wouldn't have betrayed us all and abandoned her own daughter, I thought bitterly. I took a step toward her, but hesitated, glancing back at Carson. I bit my lip.
"Go,"
he said, smiling and shaking his head in a way that made me weak in the knees. He laughed, making his bright blue eyes sparkle in the morning light.
"This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Kat. You cannot miss it. Go."
I grinned, feeling silly. "Okay," I said, and before I could lose my nerve, I stepped back to him and lifted my face to his, pressing my lips against his cheek. "I'll tell you all about it," I called over my shoulder as I jogged toward Aset.
"You better." Ma'am,"
Carlyle called just as I reached Aset. "Pick a headlamp and a flashlight, dear," Aset said to me, then looked up at Carlyle, who'd hustled over to stop at the lip of the ramp. "Yes?" He is such a Jeeves, I thought, smiling to myself as I pulled a headlamp with a lime green band onto my head. I was pretty sure it was the same one I had used before.
"Would you please let Heru know that Alexander is on his way and should arrive within the hour, but that Dominic will make the arrangements requested before picking up the Larsens and Susan Ivanov from the airport, then bringing them here along with Neffy and Jennifer Larsen."
Smiling, Aset nodded. "Yes, of course. And I'm sure my brother will appreciate it if you had Alexander join us in here as soon as he arrives, and no others until then."
"As you wish, ma'am."
He bowed his head to her. "Thank you, Carlyle." She wrapped her tiny hand around my arm just above the elbow and started leading me into the opening. I couldn't see the light from Marcus's headlamp or flashlight at all anymore.
"And, ma'am,"
Aset paused and glanced back at Carlyle.
"Alexander informed me that he's picked up another Nezarette, a man who goes by the name of Nick and claims to be one of your people. He knew enough about you and our plans that Alexander decided to grant his request to join him on his journey out here."
Carlyle attempted a smile, and a muscle in his cheek twitched.
"Though Alexander should have informed Heru before deciding to bring him, I thought it prudent to verify his identity with you before they drew much closer."
"Ah, yes." Aset offered Carlyle a smile much more genuine than his own. "Nick is mine, and I apologize for any confusion. He was supposed to meet us in Cairo, but he was held up and must have decided hitching a ride would be the easiest way to catch up to me." For once she was the one to bow her head to him. "I should have informed you, and I apologize for that oversight. I hope you'll forgive me."
"Of course, ma'am."
Carlyle turned away. Before he could take a step, Aset said, "And Carlyle, if you hear word of anyone else claiming to be one of my people, I assure you they are lying and should be handled accordingly."
"I understand."
Carlyle nodded before continuing on his way. "Shall we?" Aset pulled me toward the opening again, releasing my arm as I matched her slow steps into the darkness. It didn't remain dark for long. Under the assault of both our headlamps and flashlights, the darkness gave way to curved, silvery walls. A closer look showed me it was less silvery and more like seamless, barely opaque stone. I followed the wall on the right upward until my headlamp showed it arching overhead before cascading down the other side. I peered closer at the floor, but as far as I could tell, it was made of the same stone, though it was flat. My skin tingled, the hairs standing on end, as I realized something I should have from the moment we entered the tunnel. It wasn't made of stone. It was made of aught. Honestly, if I wasn't seeing this with my own two eyes, there's no way I'd believe there was an entire tunnel built of effing aught, I said as I continued to focus on the tunnel floor a few feet ahead of us. I mean, really? Really? It's crazy, right? Grabbing my wrist, Aset tugged on my arm, and I ceased my meandering pace onward. Look, she said, slowly scanning her flashlight beam across the way ahead. The combination of my increasingly sensitive Nezarite vision and our meager artificial light enabled me to see at least some of what lay ahead. A ghostly ancient city of large, graceful structures composed of narrow archways, elongated spires, and fluted columns. A sinuous darkness curved lazily between the buildings, drinking in the light, and I assumed it was some sort of spring-fed underground stream, snaking through an underground city that appeared to also be made of aught. Unfreaking believable. It seems so impossible, Aset said, her voice filled with longing and loss. It feels like it was just yesterday that I left her in here. Her words shocked me out of my stunned state. Her? Who? Lex? I touched Aset's shoulder, and when she didn't seem to notice, I gripped it and gave her a hard shake. Aset, are you talking about Lex? Are you saying you left her in this crypt? Did you leave her in here to die? No. Aset stared at me, her eyes wide and wild, glistening in the pale artificial light. No, she made me. She told me, Aset turned me to face her and gripped my upper arm so hard that I winced. I left her because she told me to, and when I returned, the door was sealed. She shook her head, her shimmering eyes boring into me. It had to stay sealed. She released me but continued to shake her head. We will know her fate not long from now, I think. We will know all of our fates. She forced a smile. All will work out. You will see. I blinked, narrowed my eyes, and crossed my arms, shrugging to escape her talon-like grip. Just so you know, you sound like a total crazy person. Aset let out a breathy laugh. I would imagine so, Katarina. She smiled and sighed. Come. It is too dark to make much out right now, and I have a feeling that I know where Heru went. Where? I asked, following her down a barren slope toward the stream. Home. 30. Death and Decay. Aset led me across a narrow arched bridge bordered by delicate aught filigree railings. The stream definitely had to be fed by a spring because I could hear it burbling. A slow brush of my flashlight beam showed me that the stream was lined by what appeared to be paving stones, making me think it was actually more of a canal. How is this even here? I whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly would cause it all to come crashing down around us. Heru's home is just this way, Aset said, flicking her flashlight along the path lining the opposite side of the canal. She waited for me at the foot of the bridge, and once I was across, started walking along the edge of the canal. Nuin is responsible for creating the Nezarite oasis, or cavern, I suppose it might be called now, she said with a roundabout glance. It has been here as long as I have been alive, though I suppose the oasis did grow over the years. But Lex is the one responsible for concealing it, for keeping it out of the spotlight, for protecting it from the desert. I looked at Aset, watching her delicate features as we walked. But how did she do all of that? How is this not buried in like a mile of rock? Aset paused and raised her flashlight beam to the cavern ceiling. Look up. What do you see? I followed the light, but couldn't tell much. other than that the cavern's ceiling was high overhead. So a cave popped up around this place just at the right time? You're funny, Aset said, her tinkling laugh making me smile. It didn't just pop up. Lex did it. She erected a dome of art just as the limestone cliffs shielding the oasis came crashing down on top of us. Aset's gaze became distant, and all remnants of her momentary humor disappeared. The ground shook. The screams. You cannot imagine the terror. It was clear from the tense set of her features that she didn't actually want to talk about whatever she was reliving in her memories, so I gave her a gentle tug to keep going. Sounds scary. You said Heru's place is this way? Aset cleared her throat. Yes, she said, veering to the right down a narrow alleyway between 2 rows of crumbling 2-story buildings that appeared to be constructed from regular old stone, not aught. It's just this way, across the orchard and gardens. I raised my flashlight, shining the beam along the way ahead. One of the more fanciful buildings sat on the opposite side of the orchard, more like a haunted forest with its sparse skeletal trees, its face composed of 3 graceful archways, 2 smaller ones flanking a larger, which appeared to be an open doorway. As we reached the opening, I saw that there was no door at all. I guess there wasn't much crime here. Aset stepped through the threshold and into what I could only describe as a small palace. It was more than a little haunting in the dim light. There was no need for doors, she said. Nuin forbade us from willfully harming one another, and nobody would dare defy him, at least, not until the end. I followed her into the palace. There were piles of unidentifiable things on the dust-covered floor here and there, what was left of the furniture after it rotted and collapsed on itself, I supposed. As we moved from open space to open space through these successive archways, my cursory inspection showed me that only a few pieces remained intact, all apparently made of some stone or another. It was so eerie. If ever a place was haunted, this one would be. Aset led me through one final arched doorway and stopped, staring at the man kneeling on the floor on one side of the room. There was more stone furniture in here, what appeared to be 3 beds arranged against 3 of the walls. 2 were empty. One was covered in something that looked an awful lot like a glass coffin. Aset grabbed my wrist, preventing me from moving further into the room. Marcus's head was bowed, his forehead leaning against the coffin. He had to have heard us enter, and if his eyes were open, he would see our headlamps and flashlights illuminating the eerie space, but he didn't raise his head. He didn't appear to be moving at all. I was starting to get the sick feeling that the thing he was kneeling beside didn't just look like a coffin. It was cool in the Ankh cavern compared to the desert overhead, but the chill washing over my skin had nothing to do with the temperature. Heru. Aset's voice was gentle.
I don't remember this,
Marcus said, his own voice a quiet rasp.
I remember her dying from a fever, but I don't remember this.
Her dying? I looked from Aset to Marcus and back. Are they talking about Lex? I was here with you when it happened, as was Lex. Aset sighed as she released my wrist and moved further into the room to stand beside Marcus. She gazed down at the thing and reached out to brush a thick layer of dust off the top. She loved little Tarsi very much, I think.
She was my favorite.
I know, Heru. I know. Feeling like an intruder, I snuck closer. I just couldn't help myself. The coffin was mostly opaque, thank God, because dead bodies are so not my thing. And I could just make out the shape of a person inside. A very small person. Aset placed her hand on Marcus's shoulder. Come, dear brother. There is more you must see. It took him a moment, but after a sniff and a throat clearing, Marcus stood and looked at his sister.
Did you know it would be like this under the rubble?
Aset tilted her head to the side. In a way, yes. This is how it looked.
though with less dust and rot, when we left." She glanced around the high-ceilinged room. "It is very strange to be back, and for the city to be so—" She hesitated. "So dark, so empty, so dead." She took hold of Marcus's hand and led him back out the way we had come in, through a half-dozen archways and rooms of various sizes, and out to the empty space that must have once been a garden. I followed, hanging back to give them their privacy. I considered retracing my steps and finding my way out of the fantastical ghost town, because it was starting to seriously creep me out, but the thought of getting lost creeped me out even more, so I opted to stay with Aset and Marcus. We wound along curving paths paved with worn limestone between more of the regular two-story buildings, some of which were little more than piles of crumbled stone, and around a few more of the graceful art structures similar to Marcus's home. We only stopped after we had rounded the largest, most graceful and fantastical of them all, and reached what looked to me like a mausoleum from a centuries-old cemetery. Turning away from the underwhelming little structure, I looked at the Ott Palace. My eyes followed it as it flowed upward. A few of its sleek spires actually punctured the cavern's ceiling. "I am not sure exactly how much of your memory she altered," Aset said behind me. "You and Lex spent much time in here together. Do you remember this place at all?" "No." Marcus's voice was rough. "Is it his tomb?"
"It is, and more. Lex built most of it during her time here, and you carried Nguyen's body here so she could inter him within, along with her story." Her story? I glanced over my shoulder to see them standing side by side, facing the mausoleum. Marcus was shaking his head.
"I don't remember any of that. I thought we left him in his bed when the walls came crashing down."
Aset nodded. Set remembered much the same. Lex had so many memories to alter. I'm sure she would have left you with more complete, more settling alternate memories if she could have. But she had already been through so much, expended so much power. She did what she could.
Marcus looked at her. "Was she all right?"
Aset shrugged. "More or less. She experienced much during her time here. Then changed, grew. You will be quite amazed when she returns, I think. Amazed and proud to call her your bondmate." She raised a hand, touching his arm. "She is a remarkable Nezharet, and both Nekuri and I were sorry to have to say goodbye to her when we did."
"Nekure." Heru shook his head. "I completely forgot. Where is he?"
He paused.
"Is he still—"
"Alive? Quite," Aset said. "He is on his way." She laughed. "He has changed much over the years. You'll barely recognize him." She pointed to the mausoleum, to what appeared to be a door set in the front between two slender, grooved columns. "It is like the other, attuned to your and Lex's combined bonding pheromones. You must touch it." Marcus stepped forward and reached out his arm. Like before, the slab of Ott barring his way dissolved into a colorful mist before disappearing completely. He shone his flashlight in the opening, revealing a steep stairwell that descended into darkness. And also, like before, he plunged onward without hesitation. Part of me wondered if he thought he might actually find Lex down there, like she had been waiting for him to find her for millennia. Biting my lip, I shivered, awash in dread. What if she is down there? "Come along, Katerina. There is nothing to be afraid of." Aset held her arm out to me, and together we descended the stairs.
"What the—"
Aset rushed forward a few steps. "Oh my God." Marcus was standing beside another coffin, only this one was as clear as glass and most definitely occupied. And the body it contained looked like it had stopped breathing only seconds ago. Mouth hanging open, I made it down the final few steps and, dazed, walked toward the coffin. I stood on the opposite side from Marcus and Aset and stared down at a face that was almost as shocking as the body's pristine state. "It's you," I said, raising my eyes to Marcus's face.
It's not, he said. It's the Great Father.
Nguyen? Ignoring me, he tore his gaze away from Nguyen's peaceful face to look at Aset.
Did you know about this as well?
She shook her head, her eyes wide, containing equal parts wonder and horror. He looks exactly as he did when we left him down here. How? She looked at her brother. How is this possible?
How should I know?
I cleared my throat and licked my lips, my eyes flicking down to the man who only appeared to be slumbering beneath the thin ought barrier. I, don't mean to be rude or anything, but are you sure he's dead? Yes, Aset said softly. It was what had to be. Both she and Marcus returned to staring down at the over 4,000-year dead body. Okay. Suddenly, the idea of getting lost as I tried to find my way out of this underground funhouse of WTF wasn't the creepiest option. Continuing to stare at Nguyen's dead, unrotted body was. I backed away from the coffin and turned around to study the walls. Walls were definitely a better, less creepy choice. There were hieroglyphs inscribed in neat columns on every available surface, though I had no clue what they said, and a single arched doorway set in the center of each wall. I made my way toward the one opposite the stairs and stood on its threshold while I scanned the space beyond with the beam of my flashlight. The ceiling was high and, like the doorways, arched, and the walls were covered with writing as well, though this script was flowy and cursive, and, as impossible as it seemed, written in English. Lips parted and eyes wide, I stepped closer to the wall on my right and studied the words. Sandstorm, and we almost bonded again, but I screwed up. I didn't tell you everything, and once you found out that we were bonded in the future, well, let's just say things went downhill from there. You weren't too excited about the idea of... There was no doubt in my mind that these were Lex's words. I stopped reading, feeling like I was peeking into her diary, and swept my flashlight beam over the rest of the room. When the light touched the far wall, maybe 20 paces away, I yelped and dropped my flashlight. Someone was standing in a recessed part of the wall. Heart racing and fingers shaking, I fumbled to pick up the flashlight and retrain its beam on the person. She was standing exactly where she had been, exactly as she had been. Because it's a statue, moron, I muttered to myself. I took a deep breath, then another, and started across the room. The closer I drew to the statue, the wider I opened my eyes. She was tall and slender, wearing a simple, sleeveless dress that almost reached her ankles. One foot was placed ahead of the other, like she was stepping out of the alcove, and her left hand was raised, the fingertips touching the pendant hanging around her neck, which I was positive would be a thumb-sized falcon. Marcus had given its likeness to Lex a few weeks ago, when we had still been in Florence. She was smiling, just a little, in a way that made me think she knew something, a secret or a joke or the truth about everything. But her eyes were sad, filled with longing as she gazed downward. Marcus, I whispered. I cleared my throat and tried again. Marcus.
What?
His one-word response echoed around the room. I spun, fully expecting to find him standing right behind me, or at least in the doorway, but there was no sign of him. He was probably still staring at Nguyen's not decayed even for a second body. You should see this, I said. You'll want to see this. She's right, I heard Aset say. You will want to see what awaits you in the other chambers. Go, dear brother. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his flashlight beam hitting me directly in the eyes. I raised my hand to shield my vision. Dude.
What is it that I need to see?
He said as he strode into the room. I blinked, confused. It seemed pretty obvious to me, but then I realized I was standing in front of the statue and probably blocking his view entirely. It didn't matter. He was sidetracked by the writing on the walls after barely 2 steps. He moved closer to the left wall and murmured something in another language while he traced Lex's letters with his fingertips.
Marcus, you should... Not now, cat, he said softly. Marcus! I said not. His words cut off abruptly as he spun around, facing me and finally catching sight of the statue. I moved away from it as he approached, his steps slow and almost hesitant. He stopped directly in front of her and raised his hand to trace his fingertips over every part of her face, just as he had done with her words. With a harsh, choking noise, he fell to his knees and rested his forehead against the front of her skirt. His hands clutched the sides of her dress as his whole body shook. Marcus Bahur, Heru, former leader of the Council of Seven, general to our people, and one of the most ancient and powerful Nezarets alive, was breaking down before my very eyes. I jumped at a gentle touch on my shoulder. Come, Katerina, let us give him some time alone. Nodding and numb with shock, I let Aset guide me back into Nguyen's burial chamber and up the stairs. Ah, yes, she said as we emerged from the mausoleum. She pointed across the cavern where tiny points of light were bouncing and shooting around haphazardly. I thought it was about time for them to show up. She waved her flashlights in their direction and, raising her voice enough that Nezareth ears might hear her from that distance, said, Meet us at the main bridge. It was far from a shout. One of their beams of light waved back in response, but if they said anything, my ears weren't good enough to pick up on it. Aset started walking, and I jogged a few steps to catch up to her. But how will they know where the main bridge is? Aset glanced at me, her eyebrows raised. Because Nick is there. And that makes a difference because... Aset smiled, like she only just understood my confusion. Because Nick is from here. 31. Warn and worry. Staring up at the words Lex had somehow inscribed into the solidified fabric of space and time, I sighed. I had been sitting cross-legged on the floor, also made of solidified aught, along with pretty much every part of pretty much every other building in the Oasis cavern thing, a notebook on my lap and my pen scratching against the paper as I copied down Lex's words. 4 hours. There were dozens of underground rooms like this, all with 2-inch tall words covering every available wall and ceiling space. Some rooms had arched ceilings, others just regular old flat ceilings, and the largest of all had a dome. I got the impression that Lex had been enjoying experimenting. I set down my pen as a thought struck me. What if that was the point, or at least part of the point? What if she created this place for practice? I could only assume that practicing her ability to make things out of the aught was part of the reason she created the Hall of Lex, as Carson and I had started calling it. He had thought he was so clever when he came up with the name, since Lex was also an ancient Greek root meaning word, and there were words filling this place. I rolled my eyes, but I also smiled. In the 6 hours since Marcus, Aset, and I first stepped into the tunnel, Marcus's minions had set up lighting throughout the Hall of Lex and in the half of the city on the tunnel side of the canal. They had even laid out LED ropes, creating a path from the hall across the bridge and up to the tunnel that was about a half-mile long. Not that I had had much of a chance to look around the place now that it wasn't eerily empty and quiet and dark, but filled with Nezarets bustling around to move everything into the cavern and reset up camp. Once the task of recording Lex's words in an easier-to-read format was decided, Aset suggested that only people who knew Lex well should be allowed in the subterranean hall, which meant the job of scribe went to Aset, Alexander, Marcus, Carson, and me. And Nick. I shivered, thinking about Aset's ancient, trusted companion. To say that Nick was different would be an understatement. Scares the crap out of me would be more appropriate. And it wasn't all the piercings or the black eyeliner making his crazy pale blue eyes look almost white, or the myriad of tattoos covering every visible part of him besides his face, all in various stages of fading as his body rejected them through regeneration. It was him. There was something about him that was more than a little unsettling,
about how the air pressure shifted whenever he was in a room and goosebumps covered my skin. Taking a deep breath, I shook myself in an effort to expel some of my Nick-inspired nervous jitters and returned my focus to my job. I stared at the wall and copied down Lex's words. Nguyen says that I'm picking up on how to use his chute pretty quickly. I've grown so used to being able to do unbelievable things, alter memories, share my own memories, shift from one place to another, create a sort of bonding pheromone plug that protects you from withdrawals, transform things into aught, create something from seemingly nothing. That doing those things just seems normal. I bet you can't guess what your favorite is to help me practice. Did you guess? Guess, Marcus, or I won't tell you. Just kidding. You can't get enough of me creating the bonding block, mostly because you love shredding it to pieces. I kind of love that part too. I love you. I love every version of you, and getting to know ancient Heru has been, I don't even know how to describe it. I just love being able to know you better. If I could spend the thousands of years between now and when you're reading this by your side, growing and experiencing the centuries with you, I would. I really, truly would. Regardless, know this, Heru. However much time stands between us, however much distance separates us, I will find my way back to you. I will return to you, one way or another.
Hey.
I jumped, unintentionally flinging my pen against the wall, and turned to glare over my shoulder. My glare withered the moment I laid eyes on him. Nick was standing in the archway connecting this room to Nguyen's burial chamber, leaning his shoulder against the side and looking at me. More like staring at me, I thought. Creep. I cleared my throat and reached for my pen. Hey.
I heard about your mom, Genevieve.
I offered him a none-too-friendly, tight-lipped smile. Good for you. When he didn't say anything for several heartbeats, simply continued to stare at me, I added, Did you want a trophy or something? His eyes narrowed and he straightened, taking slow steps into the room. He wasn't walking strangely, not hunched over or anything, but something about the way he moved, the controlled, withheld intensity, reminded me of a stalking lion. Setting my notebook and pen on the floor beside me, I slowly got to my feet, keeping Nick in my direct line of sight. As he came nearer, I backed up a step. Another. My back touched the grooved wall, and I glanced past him, staring longingly at the doorway. I licked my lips and attempted a weak smile. Listen, I'm sorry. That was, rude. He was only a few feet away. He took another step and seriously invaded my personal bubble, staring down at me with those eerily pale eyes. I gulped, and my fingers searched the wall behind me for a way out, though I knew they would find nothing but Lex's words. What do you want? Nick's eyes narrowed to slits, and he pressed his lips into a thin, flat line. He inhaled and, closing his eyes, grinned. Sensing that this might be my only chance to escape what was quickly turning into a totally freaky situation, I took a lurching step to the side, intending to sprint toward the doorway. Nick slammed his open hand against the wall, blocking my escape.
You're afraid of me. Good.
He leaned in closer, and I pressed my back against the wall as hard as I could to keep his body from touching mine.
That will make this so much easier.
What? I hated my stupid eyes for tearing up and balled my hands into fists to help me hold the tears in. Nick chuckled, the sound low and smooth.
I don't trust you,
he said, and I couldn't help but stare into his ice blue eyes. They were alight with fanatical intensity.
If you're hanging around here just biding your time, if you're planning on following in your mother's footsteps, I'd rethink those plans. I haven't spent over 4,000 years doing everything I can to keep Lex safe, just so some barely manifested Nezarette brat could fuck it all up. My eyes widened, and a few of those traitorous tears escaped. I shook my head vehemently. I... He leaned in closer, and there was no way to avoid it. His jeans brushed against the bare skin just below the hem of my shorts, and his black t-shirt pressed against my tank top. My already too fast breath sped up. I felt claustrophobic, trapped as I was between Nick and the wall. Nick grinned again, his eyes filled with warning. Don't even think about doing anything that would hurt Lex or hinder what she has to do. Do you understand? His face was so close. I could see the individual flecks of blue, silver, and white in his irises. Do you? Swallowing compulsively, I nodded. Hey, Carson said from the doorway. Get away from her. Nick's lips spread into that predatory grin, which I was starting to suspect was his go-to, scare the crap out of people expression, and he glanced over his shoulder. 2 birds, 1 fucking stone, he said so quietly that I doubted Carson heard him. He pushed away from the wall, from me, and stalked toward Carson. Pride welled in me as I watched Carson stand his ground. He stood taller, straightened his shoulders, and trained a steady glare on Nick. Don't you ever lay a hand on her, or you'll what? Nick stopped in front of Carson, blocking my view of him. It wasn't that he was enormously tall or thick or anything like that. He was actually pretty trim and kind of average height for a guy. But Carson was kind of small. We were pretty much the same height. Nick pretended to lunge forward and Carson jumped. Laughing softly, Nick stepped to the side and turned so he could look from me to Carson and back. I think you need a new boyfriend, Katerina. Next time, look for someone with a spine. I'm not. He's not. While Nick's attention was on me, Carson threw himself at Nick, who spun, took hold of Carson by the throat, and slammed him back against the nearest wall. Carson spluttered and kicked and clawed at Nick's arm, but none of it did any good. Nick glanced at me. Like I said. Let him go! I shrieked, finally breaking out of my terrified stupor. I took several lurching steps across the room toward him. Why are you doing this? Why? Nick returned his focus to Carson. Because there's a traitor among us, and I want to make sure he, his eyes flicked to me, or she, doesn't fuck up what has to happen. He seemed to catch himself. I've been watching you, Carson, ever since you got that position as one of Alexandra's monitors. You disappear in the OT sometimes, and I can't break through the cloak. He cocked his head to the side. What are you hiding? When Carson didn't respond, Nick squeezed his neck, and Carson's eyes bulged. Nekure, release the boy, Aset said, her words slicing through the tension. She was standing in the archway, her hands on her hips and her expression thunderous. Nick leaned in closer to Carson, growled something unintelligible, and, letting go of the younger Nezarette, stepped backward. Go find Heru, Aset said to Nick as she stepped into the room. He's up with the others. Lex's family has arrived with Dominic and Nephi, and he may need assistance. To my surprise, Nick bowed his head and strode out through the arched doorway. Aset looked at Carson, who was gasping and clutching his neck as he leaned against the wall. You go as well. I need to speak with Katerina alone. Carson shook his head. I'm not leaving her to... Go! I almost couldn't believe Aset was capable of sounding so harsh, so commanding. With a reluctant look at me, Carson walked away, too. I watched him leave, wishing I could chase after him. You should be careful of him. I nodded vehemently. I didn't even do anything to provoke him. Nick's just so... I wasn't talking about Nick. What? I blinked at Aset, scrunching my brow and shaking my head. Be careful of Carson? Nick was not lying. Carson is cloaked during brief, almost undetectable moments in the art, and we can't figure out why.
I was still shaking my head. I'm sure it's just I don't know, a misunderstanding or something? Perhaps, Aset said. She closed the distance between us and wrapped a comforting arm around my shoulders. She smiled, but it didn't quite banish the hard glint in her eyes. I sincerely hope you are right. I searched her eyes. Nick, he thinks I might be a traitor too, like my mom. I looked at the floor. Aset gave my shoulders a squeeze. Nick takes his duty very seriously, and all he knows of you is that your mother betrayed Lex by harming her sister. She nodded more to herself than to me. I'll speak with him. Clear things up. He won't bother you again. I smiled at her weakly. Okay, thanks. Now come. She guided me through the archway and into Nguyen's burial chamber. You're missing all the fun. Lex's mother fainted as soon as she saw Alexander, launching the grandmother into giving Alexander the scolding of a lifetime, and when I left, Lex's father was giving Heru a piece of his mind, and Heru was barely holding his tongue. She laughed softly, the sound echoing off the solidified Ott like hundreds of tiny bells. It is a scene I shall watch over and over again in the Ott. All right. That is it for this episode of Read by the Author. I will be back next week to continue with Lex's perspective. So until then, happy reading.